Everybody. Whoa. Kind of nostalgic to be back in this room here. Well, I'm Ben Frederick, former mayor here in Owosso and former state representative. Our current mayor, Rob Teich, really wanted to be here this afternoon to welcome you personally. Had to be out of state, so it's my privilege to serve as your host this afternoon. And it's wonderful to welcome you all to honor a great American, Owosso born and raised Thomas E. Dewey. Thomas E. Dewey saved lives. He made New York City a better place, made New York State a better place, our nation a better place, and he will forever make Owosso proud. Another reason we're here today is to celebrate the fact that nearly every historical marker in Owosso that needed refurbishment has been refurbished, including this marker today that honors the birthplace of Thomas E. Dewey. So let us start off by going through the list of what's been done from a project basis as far as our efforts at historic preservation, restoration, and addition. To take us through that list is Denise Grace, who is the head docent and curator of the Curwood Castle Museum. And many of you will probably have also read her beautifully written articles published in Michigan History Magazine. Denise.
Thank you, Ben. We have 4 different types of historical markers here in Owosso. Let's start with the bronze on stone historical markers. The bronze on stone historical markers that have been refurbished include 1, the bronze marker that honors Civil War's Quackenbush push of the post of the Grand Army of the Republic and the Women Relief Corps. That marker was placed in front of City Hall in 1920, 100 years ago. The bronze marker that honors the site where in 1835, Owosso's first pioneers, John Overton and David Van Warmer, built Owosso's first log cabin. It is also the site where Owosso's first pioneer child was born. That marker was placed by the Shiawassee chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1921. The bronze marker that honors the Comstock cabin, which was built during 1835 and 1836. This marker was also placed by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1921. The bronze marker that honors the donation of the land of Fayette Square in 1838. That marker was placed by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1926. And 6 more bronze on stone historical markers, which were replaced by the Owosso Centennial Committee in 1936, were also refurbished. Those markers include the bronze marker that honors the area where the lean-to shelter was built in about 1816 by Henry Boulet. Henry was a fur trader and the first Euro-American to frequently spend time in the area that became Owosso. The bronze marker that honors the home sites of Owosso's founders A.L. Williams and B.O. Williams. The bronze marker that honors the home site of John B. Barnes, who was a physician, a civic leader, and the 6th mayor of Owosso. He expanded Owosso's land area, and he also planted many beautiful trees in Owosso, especially the ones between Oliver Street and King Street. Most importantly, he was also an ardent abolitionist and head of Owosso's Underground Railroad. The bronze marker that honors the home of Amos Gould, who was Owosso's first lawyer and also Owosso's first mayor. He was an entrepreneur who established Owosso's first bank. The bronze marker that honors the birthplace of Frederick Friesica, who during his era became America's best-known painter internationally. He was also recognized as one of the 10 foremost contemporary artists in the world. And of course, my favorite, the one that honors James Oliver Curwood's writing studio, Curwood Castle. James Oliver Curwood, as we all know, was a best-selling author, a movie producer, and at the time of his death, the highest-paid author per word in the world. By the way, all of these historical markers were placed in Owosso decades before the state of Michigan established the historical marker program. That leaves only 2 bronze markers on stone or brick that still need to be refinished. One at Harmon Patridge Park and the one in front of Salem Lutheran Church. Both of these markers are made of an unusual alloy and require a different refurbishing method. They are scheduled to be refurbished later this year. There is also a cast aluminum historical marker that stood in front of Thomas E. Dewey's boyhood home on West Oliver until about 3 weeks ago. That historical marker was sent off to the original manufacturer for refurbishing about a month ago, and it should be shipped back to us looking like new in about 3 months. That refurbishing has already been paid for. The work is underway, and it is basically a done deal. So if we add the Dewey boyhood home marker to the 10 completed bronze on stone markers, we're up to 11 historical markers that have been refurbished. Then we have the official Michigan State historical markers. one that was placed in front of Kermit Castle in 1970, one that was placed in front of Thomas E. Dewey's birthplace in 1972, one was placed on the Comstock Cabin in 1980, and one that was placed in front of Frederick Friesike's birthplace in about 1987. All four of those historical markers have been refurbished by their original manufacturers through the state of Michigan, and those markers were returned in like new condition and have been perfectly reinstalled. Back to you, Ben.
Back to me.
Back to you.
So it's nice that we talk about the broader project before we talk about the specific marker and the specific person here. Because this effort overall over the years hasn't involved a lot of attention, just a lot of people working behind the scenes. But this doesn't just happen, it takes a lot of smart and hard work. I want to recognize Shaffer Fox for his care and determination and management of this project, which has spanned several years and sites between new installations, refurbishments, and restorative efforts of signs and plaques. This thank you is my addition because he wouldn't put it in himself and anything he writes. Thank you, Shaffer. Appreciate you. Now, it's a pleasure for me to turn the podium over to another former mayor of Owosso who did a good deal for our city, the Honorable Chris Evelyn. I was scanning earlier for Chris. Is he here? We may come back to him in the program as he has just some outline of thank yous and so on, but not seeing Chris here. I'm going to proceed into my initial speech here.
If I may, I'll just try to thank the people. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's.
I don't have any text for that.
Yeah, in the back way. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we expected Chris here, who was going to be the person who thanked everyone who's helped on this project. My gosh, first of all, my dear friend, Ben Frederick, I looked up Phil Welch. I knew who Phil Welch was because I had read about him in history books. And I knew he was a cousin of Thomas E. Dewey. And so I called him and asked if he and his lovely wife, Mary Jo, would come down here to Owosso and spend a couple hours one afternoon. And we took a tour and I showed him what I wanted to do. And he immediately put up $2,000 for the project, which was wonderful. And then I remember Ben and I met over at that nice coffee shop in downtown Durand. And I laid out what I wanted to do. I didn't even finish the sentence hardly, the first couple of sentences, and he said, I'm in. And Ben put up $2,000. So we were off and running. And we got that underway. And a Michigan historical marker has to be refurbished by the original manufacturer. Everything has to go through the state of Michigan because they want consistency. And so working on that, and then it went into other markers. We ended up, Ben sicked me on the Friesike marker up there on North Water Street. And then we did the marker in front of the hangs on the Comstock Cabin, and then the castle. And the magnificent help we had, Brent Singer. I don't see Brent here. He was going to be here. Where is he? Brent! There he is. He's the general, stand up, Brent. He's the general manager of Mauer Heating and Cooling. And he hopped in right away. And so Mauer Heating and Cooling, they took care of warehousing, first of all. The trucking firm that is contracted with the state of Michigan and the manufacturer, they have to have someone available during all working hours with a fork truck. And the people out at DPW, they come and go all day long. And Brent would make sure someone was there from 8 to 5 every day while this was going on. He had his pickup truck there, and Brent and I were climbing, remember that, out at ADP? Yeah. Climbed these towers of pallets, trying to find pallets that were the right size. And then we put them in his pickup truck, and he took them down there. He provided straps. He went out to Home Depot and got things we needed. And so they would store the markers and then coordinate with the trucking company so that just to be sure everything was fine. And he managed all that. And Kevin Maurer owns Maurer Heating and Cooling, of course. And he was absolutely wonderful. And he said, anything Brent wants to do to forward this project, go ahead and please do it. And so when we took down the markers, we took down the Kerwood Castle marker, the cabin marker, the Dewey marker. There's Jim Bowles back there, he helped with it. And Brent, my brother Mark Fox there. And who else did we have? I'm trying to think. And so we got those markers shipped off, and I know I'm missing a whole lot of people here. I'm just trying to think.
What's it?
Mike Povich helped. Gene Jankovic helped. Where's Gene? He was here. I saw him here. He helped on those things. There he is, Gene.
Why don't you raise your hand if you've had a part in some of these installation refurbishment projects. Please raise your hand, and we'll recognize all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
For your help. So I'm going to kick off a series of speeches about Thomas E. Dewey. It's quite a full life, an impactful life, and we're going to have it broken up into phases. And moving from that, close a little bit with an introduction of Mr. Welch, and then walking over to the unveil of the refurbished marker. But to start off, I'm going to speak a little bit about Thomas E. Dewey's early life. Thomas E. Dewey was born in 1902 on the second floor of a building that stood where Tim Hortons stands today. That building was built by Dewey's maternal grandparents, the Thomases. They ran a general store on the first floor of the building, and at the time, there was a large 7-room apartment on the second floor of the building. It was in a bedroom in that apartment where Thomas was born. He went on to grow up in different houses, but spent most of his youth in a house on the southeast corner of West Oliver and Pine Street in Owosso, which we all recognize, those of us in Owosso. The Deweys loved that house, and Dewey's mother lived there until she passed away in 1954. The house was also convenient because it was located only a block from Central School, which at the time also housed Owosso High School. Now, we'll set the stage with a little story that will give us an idea of the kind of person the young Thomas E. Dewey was, which I think inform his later character in his life. I think most of us know where the Arnold Clinic is on Bradley Street in Westtown. In 1948 Detroit News article, Dr. A.L. Arnold, the founder of that clinic, recalled that back in 1907 or 1908, there were a gang of bullies in Owosso who would push around the younger or weaker kids and steal marbles and other things from them. Dr. Arnold said that Dewey, who was only 5 or 6 years old at the time, formed his own gang of good guys who protected the younger and weaker kids and stood up to the older bullies and ended their racket. So some of that terminology is going to come into play later. Thomas E. Dewey was one serious character who always wanted to do the right thing. And he was also a great achiever who, through hard work, earned everything he became. During grade school at the age of 7, he began taking piano lessons and would practice the piano for an hour at home every day and for 2 hours on Saturday. Soon thereafter, he began setting type and feeding boilerplate for 10 cents per hour at his father's newspaper. At the age of 11, he took over a magazine distributorship and had 9 school classmates working for him, one of whom was Don Mitchell, who became one of Owosso's great industrialists. In high school, Dewey played the tuba in the OHS band, Go Trojans. He was on the football team, he was on the debate team, he sang in the choir, he acted in his junior and senior year plays, he was an editor-in-chief of the yearbook, he became an excellent tennis player, he took boxing lessons. He was the choir director at Owosso's Christ Episcopal Church. He swept floors and clerked in shops, spent a Christmas vacation working at the Owosso Sugar Company, and he continued to work at his father's newspaper. Of course, during this time, World War I was raging during his high school years. So he joined the Owosso Cadet Corps with 40 other boys and drilled 2 nights a week and rose to the ranks to lieutenant. And because there was a shortage of men available to work on the farms during World War I, the Boys Working Reserve was formed, and Dewey spent an entire high school summer vacation living and working as a laborer on a farm in Ovid. Dewey was also president of his senior class. He graduated a year earlier than students of the same age, and he was never tardy and never officially missed a single day of school during his 12 years of grade school and high school. How you feeling? Yes, I can tell you how I'm feeling on that list. And all of that was only part of his activities, and he did all of that before reaching the age of 18. When his mother asked him why he didn't get straight A's too, he actually graduated 8th in his class. He said, quote, "Because I don't want people to think I'm a freak." But back to when young Dewey was working as a laborer on the farm over by Ovid. He was an outstanding singer. He wanted to be a professional singer. He had a deep baritone singing voice. He used to sing, usually classical music, operas, while he milked cows on that farm in Ovid back in 1918. Just picture that going on. The farm in Ovid didn't even have an indoor plumbing, yet there was a high school student from Owosso, the nearest big city, who would become one of the most respected men in America, singing complex classical music while he milked cows. The first glimpse of Dewey on the national and state stages was in 1923 while he was a senior at the University of Michigan, and it also involved music. During that year, there was a national contest to find the best unknown singer in the nation. By then, Dewey's desire to become a professional singer had intensified. So he entered the contest, and lo and behold, the judges declared him to be the best singer in Michigan. And that earned him the right to compete in the national finals in Asheville, North Carolina. By the end of the nationals, Thomas E. Dewey had been named the third best, therefore unknown singer in the entire nation. As it was, fate eventually prevailed, and he decided to become an attorney instead. Within the 2 years that followed, Dewey toured the American Central, Midwest, and Southwest. He visited cousins in California, swam in the Pacific Ocean, and camped in the wilderness. He and a buddy later took a boat to the UK, bought an old Ford, and toured England and France. It was also during that period that he grew his famous mustache. During the same 2 years, he graduated from Columbia University School of Law, and by then he'd become fluent in French, German, Italian, Yiddish. He could speak some Russian, and he was an expert in Morse code. Yes, in addition to everything else, he was a polyglot. Dewey also began his law career during that period in 1925 as an entry-level lawyer on New York City's Wall Street, where he was just one of the thousands of young lawyers in that city who were working away pretty much unnoticed. Within 5 years, though, Dewey's powers of logic and intellect had become overwhelmingly apparent there as well. He found himself one night preparing for a trial with a brilliant and highly respected attorney, George Z. Medley, who instantly recognized that Dewey was both a perfectionist and a genius. So when President Herbert Hoover appointed Medley U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, he appointed Dewey to be his chief assistant. That made the 28-year-old Dewey the youngest person to have ever served in that role. And so Thomas E. Dewey was set on his path to becoming one of America's great attorneys and certainly the greatest prosecutor gangbuster in history. And to speak more about that, I'll turn it over to the former sheriff of Shiawassee County, our state representative for Michigan's 71st House District, Brian Begol.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here today and present for Mr. Dewey's colorful background in his life. Before we get started, I just want to kind of explain the area that Mr. Dewey was the acting assistant prosecutor in. There's 5 boroughs in New York, as you know, and essentially each one of those is a county. So the Southern District of New York not only had legal authority over New York County, which was Manhattan, but the Bronx County also, and then 6 other counties. And that was the largest of the 94 legal divisions in our nation. When Mr. Dewey was appointed chief assistant to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, he was the youngest chief assistant in New York State history. And what he faced in that position, in that city, and at that time would be almost unimaginable for Owosso here. To further understand that, let's take a journey back to that era in American history. Time was 1933. Our nation is suffering through a Great Depression, the worst economic times in the 20th century. And while New York City was an iconic beacon of arts and culture, fashion, finance, commerce in the United States, it was also one of the most corrupt cities in the world. Gangsters, racketeers, the mafia, the mob, the political party in charge in New York had a symbolic yet toxic relationship, to say the least, and that had been the norm in New York for decades and decades. Businesses in the area, they feared greatly and immensely of the mob. They were paying heavy prices to the mobsters for protection through their so-called protection unions. The mob used fear and intimidation to get a cut of nearly every business transaction in the city. So just imagine if you owned a business here in Owosso, and every once in a while some mobsters would stop by, who were all brutal thugs, would stop by. They'd want a portion or cut of what your business had made over the last week or month or so. And what would happen if you didn't pay? Despicable things would happen. Beatings, vandalism, stink bombs in your business, smoke bombs, even up to including murder. So businesses almost always paid up. The scale of corruption at that time in New York was staggering. Experts estimated that such mob activities, such as the extortion we just talked about during that era, added about 20% cost of living in the city alone. But it didn't stop there. The mob controlled everything from loan sharking to the operation of the speakeasies and to murder if anybody stood in their way. The mob's crony politicians were also getting rich. It was actually tough to get any city services done in New York without paying off a government worker first. Even an assistant clerk who issued marriage licenses in New York was making $50,000 a year, which is equivalent to $1 million nowadays, just from the tips that he demanded to issue the marriage license. Everything was for sale, and everything was rigged. From elections to government jobs, police activities, court decisions and verdicts, you name it. It was pretty much lawlessness in New York at that time. For example, a review of an 8-month history during that time in New York's criminal court showed only 4% of people who were charged with a crime ever paid a fine or were sentenced to jail. Criminals could get away with most anything, and they knew it. Honest New Yorkers thought there was nothing that could be done. It was simply to complain to the wrong person or authority could create major problems for those people, so they just chose to stay silent. Then Thomas E. Dewey stepped on the scene. Even though George Z. Medley was the Attorney General for the Southern District of New York, his assistant, Thomas Dewey, ran the office like a well-oiled machine. Everything from hiring the office's 60 attorneys and dozens of clerks, to determining their salaries and wages, to bookkeeping, filing, and facilitating the more than 40 new complaints that came into the office every day. Young Thomas Dewey worked on criminal cases and civil cases, cases that involved international laws and relations, cases that required his interaction in almost every cabinet level department in the federal government. And he did so very well. After only 3 months, Mr. Medley unleashed him on the criminals in the courtroom. And this is where one of his many legacies began. In a short time, Thomas E. Dewey developed a reputation as an incredible trial attorney. Win after win after win laid the groundwork for the office's biggest case yet, to bring down the notorious and brutal mobster Waxy Gordon. Despite immense challenges on that, Dewey fearlessly took on Waxy Gordon. After a massive 3-year investigation, constantly impeded by corrupt bankers, corrupt bookkeepers and accountants, bribe-taking police officers and politicians, witnesses who were murdered, and other witnesses who just simply disappeared, Thomas E. Dewey somehow managed to get 131 witnesses to court alive. During that landmark trial, Thomas E. Dewey displayed dozens of charts and provided 939 exhibits to the jurors. He brilliantly outmaneuvered the best defense attorneys and literally tore the gangster to pieces in 10 hours every day for 7 days straight. No one, including the judge who was presiding over the case, had ever seen anything like it. The case that Thomas E. Dewey put together in his presentation were so absolutely searing, brilliant, impeccable work that the jury had no choice but to find Waxy Gordon guilty. Indeed, Waxy Gordon was found guilty on all counts. And not only did he receive a massive fine, but he was sentenced to prison. Owosso's own 31-year-old Thomas E. Dewey, who had initially been referred to as the baby prosecutor, had done what previously thought impossible. He showed that good could triumph over evil. As a result, accolades of his work, his abilities, and his achievements intensified as he was hailed in the newspapers and on radio nationwide. And it went on from there. In the 8 years that he was a prosecutor, Dewey managed to become, like we said, the youngest chief assistant to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of the state of New York, the youngest acting U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of the state of New York, the youngest U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of the state of New York, the youngest counsel to the Bar Association of New York, and the first person to have been appointed as special prosecutor, which essentially is a gangbuster for the U.S. Attorney of the Southern District in the state of New York. And he served as District Attorney of New York County, which we said was Manhattan, from 1938 to 1941. What Thomas E. Dewey accomplished during this time as prosecutor was no easy task. He faced opposition every step of the way, yet never wavered in his goal. Mobsters and other criminals constantly tried to outsmart him, intimidate him, and even assassinate him, but he was relentless. During those years, Thomas E. Dewey severely damaged, diminished, and often completely ended the careers of 94% of mobsters and criminals he tried in court. During just one 2-year period, from 1935 to 1937, Thomas E. Dewey investigated, indicted, and took to court 73 hardcore mobsters and won convictions against 72 of them. That's an otherwise unheard of 98% conviction rate. Among those criminals Thomas E. Dewey convicted was the mobster who earned the name Labor Racketeer No. 1. Another one who was referred to as the mafia boss of all bosses. Another one was the nation's #1 industrial racketeer. Another was the New York City's public enemy #1. Two of them, who were at different times the FBI's public enemy #1, and two more were co-founders of Murder Incorporated. Another who was named the most dangerous man on earth, and yet another who was the first official boss of the Genovese crime family and the founder of the chief of the Mafia's Commission. During his time in office, Thomas E. Dewey was also responsible for convicting a number of corrupt politicians, corrupt judges, corrupt government workers, including police officers who were on the take, owners and managers of the largest prostitution ring in history, and additionally, people responsible who were involved in mail fraud, securities fraud, stock manipulation, tax evasion, organized gambling, perjury, blackmail, kidnapping, arson, assault, murder, and drug dealing, including heroin trafficking. He reduced human smuggling and illegal immigration into the United States through New York by 99%, and he convicted New York's 36 most sadistic loan sharks. But Thomas E. Dewey wasn't always just working to put people behind bars. He also cleaned out the jails of people who had been illegally incarcerated. He improved legal aid to those who couldn't afford attorneys. He gave instructional lectures to personnel of district offices and police departments on the importance of ending corruption and respecting civil liberties. And because there was so much corruption in New York City, he originated the use of the city police department detectives assigned to and directed by himself, the district attorney at the time, which today, 80 years later, is one of the organization's most successful investigative arms that was formed in that department. And he's famous for that. Those were called the New York City Detective Investigators Association, or also known as the DIA. In fact, Mr. Shaffer told me that he ran into the head of the DIA in New York, and the guy immediately recognized who Mr. Dewey was and how proud they were to be part of that long legacy there in the city. In fact, so much so that if you go to their website, it says, "We trace our roots back to Thomas E. Dewey's hand-picked racket busters of the 1930s that successfully tackled organized crime and corruption in the city. Thomas E. Dewey also broke the colors code by appointing 3 African Americans to serve as prosecutors in the courts in New York State. Thomas E. Dewey reformed and improved the legal justice system by rewriting, with his assistant, over 100 of the antiquated and almost incomprehensible indictment forms that were in use at the time. What became called the Dewey indictments tremendously simplified procedures, saved time, reduced mistakes, and were lauded in the 1939 commentary in the Harvard Law Review. Thomas E. Dewey also wrote the statutes that became the model for the now famous racketeer influence and corrupt organization laws, better known as RICO. And speaking of fame, Thomas E. Dewey became famous right along with his accomplishments. And to learn more of that, I'm going to turn it over to our local historian and initiator, our hands-on manager of the Historical Marker Program, Mr. Shaffer Fox. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. It's so good to be here with you all. Hello, everyone. Back in the 1930s and 40s, before the days of television, and long before the internet, people got their news by reading newspapers and magazines, by listening to the radio, and by watching newsreels at movie theaters. During that era, Thomas E. Dewey had become so popular, so admired, so respected, that when his likeness appeared in movie newsreels, it was common for entire theater audiences to erupt in raucous applause, cheers, and whistling. And that occurred coast to coast, across America, and even at times overseas. Audiences at movie theaters sometimes even gave newsreel appearances of Thomas E. Dewey standing ovations. No one can remember that ever happening before for anyone. Indeed, during the era, an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer exclaimed, "If you don't think Thomas E. Dewey is public hero #1, just listen to the applause he gets every time he is shown in a newsreel." It was like critical mass. It was simultaneously happening everywhere, in small communities, out in the Dust Bowl, in huge cities like Los Angeles, up in towns in the Rocky Mountains, everywhere. In print mediums, articles about Thomas E. Dewey were published myriad times in domestic and foreign newspapers and in magazines as well. Thomas E. Dewey appeared on the covers of nearly every important magazine, and sometimes repeatedly. New Yorkers, the North American public, and the media gave Thomas E. Dewey the nicknames the Rat Exterminator, the Crime Smasher, the Enemy of Corruption, Jack the Giant Killer, the Racket Buster, the Gang Buster, the Savior of New York City, the Boy Wonder from Owosso, and the nickname I'm sure we all like the best, the Boy Wonder from Owosso. Popular syndicated national radio shows titled Mr. District Attorney, G-Men, and later Gangbusters were based on Thomas E. Dewey's exploits against the mob. Thomas E. Dewey's methods and successes also inspired movies, which starred some of Hollywood's biggest and best actors and actresses, including even Humphrey Bogart and Bette Davis. The historian and author Richard Norton Smith noted that Hollywood in the late 1930s was cranking out a movie a week, inspired by Thomas E. Dewey's exploits against corruption and the mob. People believed, and with sound reasoning, that Owosso's Thomas E. Dewey was the greatest, the smartest, the bravest G-man, investigator, lawyer, prosecutor, and government administrator who had ever lived. Thomas E. Dewey was also deemed to be the most honest person alive, and the one person alive, maybe the only person alive, who could solve any problem. Across the English-speaking world during the 1930s, the 1940s, and early 50s, The comment most used by any group or company that just couldn't seem to solve a problem was, what we need around this place is a Thomas E. Dewey. One of the many nice side effects of such fame was that when an article, a broadcast, or a newsreel included Thomas E. Dewey's biographical information, it always included a mention of and often described the place where Thomas E. Dewey was born and raised, and that's our precious, beloved city of Owosso. God love Owosso. During the same era and beyond, it was common for traveling Michiganders to be asked, and they could be identified by their license plates or, in a simple conversation, where you're from and everything. The first question was, oftentimes, so how far do you live from Owosso? Or do you know Thomas E. Dewey? And even though the Chicago Tribune stated that Thomas E. Dewey turned down literally thousands of invitations for speeches and public honors, including college degrees, he still ended up being the recipient of 16 honorary degrees, and he is the only person to have ever received honorary degrees from Harvard, Princeton, and Yale in a single week. Admiration and respect for Thomas E. Dewey reached such a fervor that people who wanted to get a difficult task done would often write to Thomas E. Dewey for help. For example, while Thomas E. Dewey was serving as the district attorney of New York County, 6 national organizations came together and were trying to form something called the USO. And as we all know today, the USO is an organization that provides entertainment and off-base recreation centers for U.S. military personnel serving around the world. Back in 1941, the federal government agreed to provide buildings for the USO, but only if the operations of something called the USO were better defined, and only if $10.5 million to $219 million in today's money could be raised, or was raised, through donations to fund the USO operations. Because of Thomas E. Dewey's integrity and his national reputation of getting good things done, they asked him to form and lead the committee to 1, do the research to determine what the USO should be, and 2, lead the fundraising and bring in enough money to make the USO operational. And that is exactly what Thomas E. Dewey did. So the next time, So the next time you see something about the USO in a movie about World War II, or the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, or you hear loved ones describe a USO event or club they went to anywhere in the world, you can be proud that it was a man from Owosso who led the charge to make the USO a reality. It's an amazing thing. The things Thomas E. Dewey accomplished during his years as prosecutor are astounding, but Thomas E. Dewey also had another career, and that was as an extremely effective and respected government administrator, and he was undoubtedly one of the most well-known politicians to ever live. So to learn more about that part of Thomas E. Dewey's life, we're going to turn it all over to our friend Greg Groder. Now, Greg and his wife Diane, where's Diane, Greg?
Couldn't make it today.
Oh gosh, have lived in Owosso for over 30 years. Together, greatness is all over the place in Owosso. Together, they authored over 50 books, at least 10 of which were on the New York Times bestseller list. Greg also co-authored 4 novels with former Owosso resident Dave Gallagher. And I remember when their Star Trek books came out, he had something like 30-some Star Trek books, 29, 30, 33. Star Trek books. They got, one of their Star Trek books was the first Star Trek book to be on the New York Times bestseller list, and I've heard repeatedly that they kept Star Trek on the New York Times bestseller list for something like 15 years. Greg recently retired from a 20-year career as a software developer, and he's the current chairman of the Shiawassee Commission. And wow, the improvements we've all seen over there. And so without anything further on all of that, we want to welcome our great friend, Greg Broder.
Thank you, Shaffer, for that very kind introduction. You'll notice I'm wearing since I'm doing a little history lecture, I'm wearing my college professor outfit with pencil. So, in case you're wondering, yes, there will be a quiz afterward. Now, Thomas E. Dewey's initial career was actually, as you've already heard, to become an opera singer. Fortunately for the world, he instead became one of the great prosecutors of all time, but he was born with politics in his blood. In fact, his paternal grandfather was known throughout the country as a great orator, and was very much involved in many things, including the William McKinley campaign, and was even offered ambassadorships to both Spain and Turkey. Thomas E. Dewey himself became active in politics when he joined the Young Republicans in New York after graduating from law school in 1925. His work pretty much entailed promoting Republican candidates by knocking doors in Greenwich Village and writing letters to support Republican candidates. Appreciation and respect for his work built up, and in 1931 he was named chairman of the Young Republican Club. In 1937, Thomas E. Dewey ran for political office himself. As his term was ending as a special prosecutor, it's already been talked about, and a gangbuster for the Southern District of the state of New York, Thomas E. Dewey opened what would have become a highly successful New York law office. I'm sure he would have made a fortune. However, he gave it up when he was drafted to run for district attorney of the city of New York, which of course, as you know, is Manhattan. Voters were so pleased with Dewey's management skills and his successes against the mobsters and corruption that on voting day, even people in other counties of New York City were trying to vote for him. Seriously, the biographer Richard Norton Smith reported that election officials in Brooklyn had to post large signs outside of the election places saying, "Dewey isn't running in this county," to try to stop people from coming in and wanting to vote for him. Very popular guy. A year later, in 1938, the chairman of the Republican Party in New York State chose Thomas E. Dewey to run for governor there. He was only 36 years old, and he lost his first election by a very slim margin, 64,000 votes, which is about 1.4% of the vote, against a very highly respected incumbent governor of what was the largest state in the Union at the time. However, only 2 years later, Dewey ran for governor again and won by a landslide. He became the first Republican governor of New York State in 20 years. 4 years later, 1946, he ran for re-election again, won by a large margin, in fact, the greatest margin that had been won by any governor in New York's history. Ran again in 1950, and again easily won. Very, very popular man, very accomplished. Not surprising, during Dewey's 12 years as governor of the state of New York, he ran one of the most remarkably honest and effective gubernatorial administrations in history. As governor, Dewey passed the state's first law anywhere that banned discrimination in hiring, and passed a law that guaranteed equal pay for both men and women. It was also mentioned earlier, it was Thomas E. Dewey that broke the color code in New York State by hiring 2 men and 1 woman who were the first African Americans to serve as assistant district attorneys in New York. Later in 1943, while serving as governor of New York, Thomas E. Dewey appointed one of those African American assistant district attorneys. As governor, Dewey also increased employment, consolidated and streamlined government agencies, doubled state funding to local governments for education, increased disability and unemployment benefits, increased salaries of state employees during a time when the state employees were deemed to be underpaid, and he was still able to lower taxes by 10% and cut the state's deficit by well over $1.3 billion in today's money. He created a post-war reconstruction fund that was equivalent to well over 8.2 billion in today's money. That fund was used to create a model veterans program that provided convalescent centers, personal health services, and housing for over 60,000 veterans. The fund was also used to remove slums, reduce water pollution, enhance reforestation by planting 34 million trees, create public housing for 30,000 families, enlarge New York's mental health system by 14,000 beds, to create New York's first Department of Commerce, and attract new businesses and tourists to the state, and to help people run new businesses. Dewey's Department of Commerce helped result in 135,000 new businesses that were started in New York between 1945 and 1948 alone. And Thomas Dewey negotiated and helped make possible the great hydroelectric facilities on the Niagara and the St. Lawrence rivers. Not yet done. In education, Thomas E. Dewey was deeply disturbed by the highly discriminatory practice of the elite private colleges and universities in the northeastern United States. He recognized that the citizens of his state needed greater access to high quality, higher education, and that access should be regardless of race, heritage, color, religion, and so on. Therefore, in 1946, Thomas E. Dewey formed the Temporary Commission on the Need for a State University. In 1948, he accepted the Commission's final report. Today, the state university system of the state of New York is the largest system of colleges and universities in the United States, with 64 campuses and 450,000 students, plus over 1 million adult education students. Thomas E. Dewey also created the School of Industrial and Labor Relations of the Ivy League member, Cornell University. In 1946, Dewey proposed the New York State Thruway System. The opposing political party fought hard against it. They even called it Dewey's Folly, but Thomas E. Dewey prevailed, as he seems to always do in his life. The project was launched and completed under budget. At the time, the last segment of the 426-mile-long main line of the Thruway, when it was completed, it was the longest toll highway system in the world. It reduced the driving time between New York's two biggest cities, New York City and Buffalo, by 9 hours. His list of accomplishments goes on and on. This is a very brief overview of an unbelievably accomplished man. As we all know, Thomas E. Dewey also ran for president. To cover that period of his life, I'd like to turn this over to our friend Bill Ballinger. Bill Ballinger has earned his his bachelor's degree from Princeton University, his MPA from Harvard. He was a professor of American government at Central Michigan University. He's both a former Michigan State Representative and Michigan State Senator, and he served in Washington as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare under President Gerald R. Ford. He was also, as probably many of us in the room know, an editor of Inside Michigan Politics. He founded the Ballinger Report, and for decades he's been a panelist on WKIR TV's Off the Record with Tim Subic. Bill, over to you.
So, thank you, Greg. You know what? I think I've misplaced my speech that I gave back in 1972 on the bridge out here when they dedicated the first marker, but fortunately for you, Greg has given me a script. Okay? It's probably going to be a much better talk. Anyway, I feel like I'm indulging in overkill at this point because I think we've gotten the impression that Thomas E. Dewey was a pretty impressive individual. What more can I say? But I've been asked to say more, so, you know, that's no problem for me. So, let me just start by saying from the script, as has been stated, there were nearly constant national headlines about Thomas E. Dewey's victories against corruption and the mob. And that made him a standout favorite to win the presidency of the United States in the 1940 election. However, as the Nazi war machine raced across Europe, Republican leaders grew increasingly concerned about 38-year-old Thomas E. Dewey's lack of foreign policy experience. Now remember, in 1940, there was also a question about should Franklin D. Roosevelt run for a third term. No president had ever served more than 2 terms. But Franklin D. Roosevelt decided, okay, I'm running. So think about this. Dewey had run for governor in New York, despite all his successes as a crime buster. He had lost. And yet, in 1940, he was actually in first place after the first ballot at the Republican National Convention. I mean, that is extraordinary. It's never happened before or since. In fact, I'm just going to tell you one real piece of trivia. I think Thomas E. Dewey is the only Republican to ever either lead on the first ballot at a national convention or be the nominee in 3 successive conventions, okay? Democrats have somebody who meets that standard. Who was it? Grover Cleveland in the 80s. 1884, 88, 92, won the Democratic nomination at 3 straight conventions and was elected president the first and third time he ran. The second time he ran, he actually had more votes than Benjamin Harrison, but he lost in the Electoral College. So he got 3 and Dewey got 3. So, at the Republican National Convention during June of 1940, while Thomas E. Dewey led on the first ballot, he lost his party nomination to Wendell Willkie on the 6th ballot. A few minutes later, Willkie lost to Roosevelt in the general election. By the presidential campaign of 1944, remember this, he had just been elected for the first time governor of New York in 1942. So he made up for his defeat 4 years earlier by getting elected in 1942. And Thomas E. Dewey's opinions on foreign policy had matured, and he won that year's Republican nomination for president on the first ballot by 1,056 votes to 1. By then, though, World War II was going well in the United States, and few expected Thomas E. Dewey to defeat the beloved incumbent wartime President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But even though Dewey was defeated by Roosevelt in the general election, he did better than any of Roosevelt's prior 3 Republican opponents. That would have been Willkie, Alf Landon in 1936, and Herbert Hoover in 1932. Plus, Thomas E. Dewey won the vote in Roosevelt's hometown of Hyde Park, New York. Talk about hurting the guy. And he won the vote in Vice President Harry Truman's hometown of Independence, Missouri. In 1948, Thomas E. Dewey won the Republican nomination for president again. And the second time, it was on the 3rd ballot by 1,094 votes to 0. Now this time, nearly everyone believed that Thomas E. Dewey would win the presidency. He was so far ahead of his Democratic opponent, incumbent President Harry S. Truman, that polling companies quit polling. Even the New York Times stated that Thomas E. Dewey's election was a, quote, foregone conclusion. And by the way, I'll just parenthetically note, there was a book that came out a few years ago, maybe some of you read it, by Thomas Mallon, M-A-L-L-O-N, called Dewey Defeats Truman, okay? And it's about life in Owosso in 1948, and it's really a great book with the backdrop of the Dewey versus Truman campaign. But then, while this is going on, 48, Dewey looks like a shoo-in, right? Then he made one of the very few mistakes, maybe the only major mistake of his life. He He ran a campaign designed to not offend anyone. He refused to criticize his opponent, and he was determined to appear as nonpartisan as possible. His philosophy, as he once exclaimed to a supporter, was, quote, "When you're ahead, don't talk." So, when Thomas E. Dewey did talk, it was often in empty platitudes. And he was described in an editorial, this is a really good one, by the Louisville Courier-Journal, and I'm going to quote here. "No presidential candidate in the future will be so inept that 4 of his major speeches can be boiled down to these historic 4 sentences. Agriculture is important. Our rivers are full of fish. You cannot have freedom without liberty. Our future lies ahead," unquote. Suddenly, Thomas E. Dewey, the man who could instantly marshal any number of facts to win a debate, refused to state anything negative about anyone. He wouldn't even defend himself when he was attacked. And then there was his opponent, President Truman. The more complacent Thomas E. Dewey became, the more President Truman went on the attack. No matter what the polls showed, no matter what anyone said, President Truman was determined to win re-election. So, during the final weeks of the campaign, I think many of you know about this already, President Harry S. Truman went on a 21,000-mile whistle-stop tour, attacking the Republicans in more than 300 speeches in over 250 cities. And every one of those speeches was reported in newspapers and radio. And that is where the term, "Give 'em hell, Harry," originated. There are many reasons why a political candidate loses an election. What I just described is primarily how, to nearly everyone's amazement, Thomas E. Dewey lost the presidential election of 1948 in one of the biggest political upsets in history. As a sign of respect and an example of great magnanimity, 2 years after the election, President Truman offered the ambassadorship to the United Kingdom to Thomas E. Dewey. But Thomas E. Dewey decided to continue serving as the governor of New York until his final term ended on December 31st, 1954. I'm just going to say, parenthetically, it's totally off base. Truman could have been pretty smart doing that. Get Dewey out of the country, send him over here. We don't want him running for president. Okay, so I think maybe there was more than magnanimity involved. Anyway, Dewey then retired from running for political offices and returned to practicing law, which made him a wealthy man, although he continued to be an important advisor to the nation's top political leaders. Indeed, Thomas E. Dewey was instrumental in convincing Dwight D. Eisenhower to run for president, and several of Dewey's aides and advisors became key officials in the Eisenhower administration. Both President Eisenhower in 1953 and President Nixon in 1969 offered Thomas E. Dewey the position of Chief Justice of the United States. I mean, it's amazing. I'll just mention parenthetically again, Charles Evans Hughes lost the 1916 presidential election to Woodrow Wilson, and he was later appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So this could have been the second time that happened. But Dewey politely turned down those offers. I'd like to hear the story at some point, you know, from insiders about why he did. The state of New York published that Thomas E. Dewey also turned down an offer to become Secretary of State of the United States. I'm not sure that the state of New York publishes anything, but whatever, this is my script, so I'm reading it. Thomas E. Dewey was fastidious about not corrupting any public office he held. When Thomas E. Dewey was a prosecutor, and movies and radio shows based on his exploits against the mob were ubiquitous, he could have made millions. But to his credit, he refused to capitalize monetarily on his name and his fame. During his political career, Thomas E. Dewey also refused any anonymous campaign contributions. He also had every large contributor investigated before accepting his or her money. Can you imagine that today? Thomas E. Dewey was the author of 4 books, and he was also a farmer. Back in 1939, he bought a beautiful house on a 300-acre farm 65 miles north of New York City, and spent as many weekends there as possible. I think that was Pauling, New York. And by the way, when I came to Shiawassee County in the summer of 1965 with my bride, the former Bunny Woodard, we rented a house at the corner of Hibbard, West Hibbard and Leland Road, 8450 West Hibbard Road. And a mile east of it was the Earl Putnam Farm, where Thomas E. Dewey worked. And I knew Earl Putnam, and he stood with me on the bridge in 1972 when I made that talk, when the marker was first dedicated to Dewey. So that, to me, was an incredible story. In 1964, as has been stated, the New York State Thruway was renamed Governor Thomas E. Dewey Thruway. On September 8, 1988, which was the 40th anniversary of Thomas E. Dewey's recommendation to the state legislature that the state university system be established, the State University of New York at Albany dedicated and named one of its libraries the Governor Thomas E. Dewey Graduate Library for Public Affairs and Policy. The State University of New York at Albany proudly refers to Thomas E. Dewey as, quote, the father of the State University of New York, unquote. Thomas E. Dewey is also lauded for creating the School of Industrial and Labor Relations of Ivy League member Cornell University, which has been mentioned earlier. The New York City Bar Association annually awards the Thomas E. Dewey Medal to one outstanding assistant district attorney in each of New York City's 5 counties. In the 1900s, Drew Pearson, who was a famous columnist, many of you may remember, and Robert S. Allen wrote in their popular syndicated newspaper column, Washington Merry-Go-Round, that Thomas E. Dewey was, quote, the young man who came to Manhattan to be an opera singer and stayed to chase out crime, unquote. The Pulitzer Prize newspaper editor, William Allen White, who was known as the unofficial national spokesman for Middle America, described Thomas E. Dewey as, quote, an honest cop with the mind of an honest cop, unquote. In 1944, the author Stanley Walker wrote that Thomas E. Dewey, quote, fears the face of no man, unquote. The writer, Riley Neutrino, stated that, quote, Thomas E. Dewey wanted more than money. He wanted to turn New York, get this, into something similar to his own little small town. I don't think, maybe that was in the cards. An article by Russell Fowler, published in the November 2017 issue of the Journal of the Tennessee Bar Association, stated that the keys to Thomas E. Dewey's successes were, quote, integrity, hard work, and courage, unquote. In 2004, Columbia University published on its website, quote, an outstanding individual. Thomas E. Dewey made a remarkable contribution to both the annals of crime fighting and our political culture, unquote. The New World Encyclopedia states, quote, under his, meaning Thomas E. Dewey's, leadership, New York was the first state in the nation to enact laws prohibiting racial or religious discrimination in employment and education, unquote. The encyclopedia also states that, quote, Thomas E. Dewey's interaction with Taft and Eisenhower led to a crucial role in moving the United States forward as a world power in the years following World War II. George Gallup, the founder of the Gallup poll, who knew just about everyone in politics, stated that Thomas E. Dewey was, quote, the ablest public figure of his lifetime, unquote. Think of that. Lowell Thomas, who was one of the most famous writers, commentators, and broadcasters of the 20th century, stated that Thomas E. Dewey was, quote, just about the most impressive man that I ever knew, unquote. He also referred to Thomas E. Dewey as, quote, an authentic colossus, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, this man was from Owosso. Not only that, he collected a lot of Deweys around and Welch's and other people related to him for years afterwards. So, I mean, there's a legacy of Deweyism here. May what we do today help to sear the memory of Thomas E. Dewey's greatness and therefore Owosso's greatness into the minds of people for hundreds of years to come. Back to you, Ben.
Our rivers are full of fish. Things all come around. Thank you, Bill. It's actually very appropriate that Bill Ballinger is our last formal speaker today. After all, it was Bill who gave the speech during the original unveiling of the Michigan historical marker that honors the birthplace of Thomas E. Dewey over 50 years ago on May 22nd of 1972. So we're kind of completing and going full circle here this afternoon. Also attending the unveiling of that marker over 50 years ago was Earl Putnam, upon whose farm in Ovid, Thomas E. Dewey worked as a teenager and a member of the Boys Working Reserve during World War I. Mr. Putnam and Thomas E. Dewey's first cousin, Mrs. Harriet Dewey Welch, performed that unveiling. So we're delighted to have joining us as one of the people unveiling the refurbished Dewey marker, Mrs. Harriet Dewey Welch's son, Phil Welch, who is a cousin of Thomas E. Dewey. I'm going to hand it over to Shaffer in a moment, but when these remarks conclude, and we may have a couple others as well, we're going to proceed immediately to the marker site and unveil that marker. And then you're welcome to remain for some social time at Tim Hortons afterward as well. So Shaffer, would you like to tell us a little bit about Phil?
Thank you so much, Ben.
Get toward our conclusion.
Thank you, buddy. Thank you. And by the way, first of all, just a couple of words about Ben because he won't say this about himself. Ben Frederick was a 4-term city councilman here in Owosso. 3 of those terms, he was the mayor of Owosso. Then he went on to become our state representative in Lansing. And during his last term, he was the majority floor leader in the Michigan House of Representatives. Now, I did some really in-depth research on this because you never want to be wrong about anything, but everything, it really looks like, and I'm 99% certain, that is the highest position ever held by anyone in Owosso, by someone from Owosso, the majority floor leader of the Michigan House. That's Ben Frederick. And let me tell you, this guy has a heart as big as this world. And I can think of many times, since I've been back in 2008, and I was on these different groups where we would be doing volunteer civil improvement work, where we had a problem where we thought, oh my gosh, the world is ending, and we couldn't figure out what to do, and we'd have some pretty smart people on those boards, and we'd go, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And I'd call Ben, And he'd say, well, why don't you do this? And he was right every single time. He's, I just love him so much. He's a wonderful Now, on to Phil Welch. I've read about Phil because I've done a lot of history writing for the Downtown Historic District and different things. And I'd read about Phil and his mother and his family. And that's all I knew was that he was Thomas E. Dewey's cousin. And then he came to Owosso and we talked, he and Mary Jo, and we drove around and everything. And he put up $2,000 for the marker. And wow, that $2,000 and Ben's $2,000 has gone a long way because of all the grants we got. And by the way, someone I forgot here, Phil. Members of the Owosso Historical Commission who are here, stand up. There you go. They put up, because when we have a grant, it's like a 60-40 grant. And so Nathan Henney and I won these little-known grants. So that meant we didn't have to use as much of Phil's money and Ben's money. And then the Owosso Historical Commission came in, and they paid the match on the grant for the Frisiki marker, the cabin marker, and maybe the castle marker, I can't remember. And so that let Phil's money go farther and Ben's money go farther so we could do other things too. And the Owosso, or the Shiawassee Historical Society, there's Marianne Laux back there. Who else is with him? John Bloomfield, I haven't seen you forever. There he is, John, yeah, hi. If it weren't for the Shiawassee Historical Society, we wouldn't have a Dewey marker here, possibly, because they are the ones who paid for and installed that marker back in 1972. So a big round of applause for Okay, so what I found out about Phil Welch is that he's not only Thomas E. Dewey's cousin, he is the great-great-grandson of Alfred Williams and the great-great-grandnephew of Benjamin Williams, the two people who founded Owosso. Wow. My gosh, you know, there's, that's about as close to Owosso royalty as you can get. And I hope everyone in here today, before this thing is over, shakes his hand, because that will be something you will remember for the rest of your life. I mean, really, if it weren't for Phil's great-great-grandfather and great-great-uncle, great-great-granduncle, Owosso wouldn't be here. And most of us in this room wouldn't even exist. Just imagine that. That's a fact. That's the truth. So some other things I found out about Phil was he was the vice president of the Dewey Corporation. Everyone remember Dewey? They did the air purification systems and everything. Very, very successful company. And, you know, once you're dealing with someone, you may have heard his name 20 times in the past, and it just goes in one ear and out the other. But once you've met a person, you start listening. I have met so many people who said that Phil Welch created more millionaires in Owosso than anyone in the history of Owosso. He went, and people, they say he was the greatest mentor anyone could ever have. And people would go over there and work for him, and he was such a nice guy, and he was so smart, and he taught them so well that eventually these people would go off and start their own business.
Yeah, but they left Owosso.
No, that's not true. No, they're here. There's only one, yeah, there's only one that left. Yeah, the other ones, they're right around here, same business. They learned from Phil and went and started their own businesses.
Right.
And our own mayor today, Rob Teich, who couldn't be here, and he's so upset that he couldn't be here. Rob Teich told me, and Rob's a wonderful guy, he told me that there is no one on earth for whom he has greater respect than Phil Welch.
Wow.
Isn't that saying something? And so Phil was kind enough to drive down here with his lovely wife, Mary Jo, and he was actually now I remember reading that one of Dewey's last trips, it may have been the last trip to Owosso, was to come and stay at Phil's mother's house. He loved his cousins and loved his aunts, and Phil and Mary Jo were also at Thomas E. Dewey's funeral up in New York City with all the dignitaries and everything. So I hope you will just open up and share all your memories with us, Phil. Phil Welch.
And,
Go blue.
Big old move for them. And we had many family gatherings with Tom and his family and his mother and his sons and mainly fun times. Nothing very serious politically there. Just good times. And I remember one night his mother was so embarrassed. We had this family dinner that my mother had fussed over, and she had a pan of butter on a plate, and their son John. Somebody said, "Well, pass the butter." So he took a knife, stuck it in the butter, and said, "Here, anybody want any butter?" That was not exactly the formality that we had in mind. But that was the kind of a casual relationship we had as a family, which was appreciated very much. Other than that, really we had, talking about dual industries, Tom did have a law business, and when John, my brother, started Dual, he approached Tom, and Tom helped him set up the legal aspects of Dual Industries, which was a great help, and made it noteworthy for us to have something like that on our staff doing that. And then, they got busy, and we got busy, and the next thing we knew, we were at Tom's funeral, and we were chosen by the family to attend the funeral, which was an honor for us. And we flew out, went to the funeral, and afterwards went to Tom had an apartment in New York, and we went there and met a lot of the people who were at the funeral, including the Nixons, and I've got a list of people, but there were a lot of really noteworthy people. It was just fun to be in that casual setting with them. And so it was a really nice thing.
Nelson and Happy both.
And I really have nothing more to say other than thank you very much. It's great to honor him like this, and I feel honored as well. So thank you.
Can I just say one funny thing that happened?
Sure.
This was when he was running against Truman in 1948. And it was Easter time, and my folks got to know Annie Dewey, his mom. And anyway, it was kind of fun because they asked her to go out for dinner, and it was on Easter Sunday. So we went over, there was a neat restaurant, I wish I could remember the name of it, in Flint. It used to be there on a corner, on the main street in Flint.
Cromer's.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anyway, we took off for dinner or whatever, came back, and Meet the Press was on. And there, we had a TV set, and that was really, this is 1948, and there weren't many TV sets around, but we had one. And Annie, we had her come and sit, and she was sitting in front of the TV set like this, with her legs kind of like this, and she'd say, sit there really intense. And then all of a sudden she'd say, "Atta boy, Tom, you give him hell." I'll never forget.
Anyway, thank you.
I think everyone knows dear Sue Degerstrom. Sue Storer Degerstrom, what a great gal. She was great Grand Marshal and everything. She did so much for Owosso. just love her to pieces, and she's here with her daughter Jan. And Sue used to drive Thomas E. Dewey's mother home from church every Sunday. And she has a couple of other funny stories too, so I hope, Jan, will you come up here with Sue and tell what you remember about that era, okay?
I've been sitting
Let's go up there with her, Jane.
Yeah, I know.
Well, yeah, I've been in Owosso a long time now. But, Bill, Mr. Ballinger, you explained something for me very much. Back in 1948, I was at college in Michigan State, and we had busboys from New York State. And guess what they said to me?
What?
Tom's not gonna make it.
Really?
And I was so appalled, I didn't ask him, why are you saying that?
Yeah.
And I wish to this day I had asked him one.
Did they ever give you a reason?
No.
They were probably Democrats.
They probably thought Harry was gonna really give him hell, I don't know. But I just think how wonderful it'd been if Tom had been elected. He would have cleaned up this country pretty good, I think.
We need him back again.
Yeah, right, and we need somebody like him now. So anyway,
Really?
what I have to talk about mostly is the church, and I knew he sang in the choir. I didn't realize he had directed him. I had directed that choir myself, and that's a good enjoyment to do that. And I did drive Annie Dewey home a couple of times from church. I didn't keep track about that, but and oftentimes Tom would and his wife would come to Owosso to visit Mom and be at church, and we were always so happy to see them. And he gifted the church with the beautiful lights in the ceiling.
Really?
Yeah, he was very generous.
The Episcopal Church?
What? Yeah.
The Episcopal
right, the
Church,
Episcopal
yeah.
Church. And things are sure different in churches these days, unfortunately. But we had our pictures taken with him. He would pose with us, young kids in the junior choir, and we felt real proud. And my father, R.L. Storer, he headed up the school board for a few years, but when the new high school was built. And he invited Tom to come to the dedication. And by golly, he came.
No kidding.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he did. He did.
It was a wonderful moment. And
Great.
very good of him. What a great man he was, and how sad that he didn't get elected president.
Maybe we didn't deserve it.
What?
Maybe we didn't deserve it. He was too good for us.
Oh, that's so sad. So sad. Well, my mother was born the same year Tom was, and they were in high school.
Oh,
together.
really?
So she used to talk about him a little bit. But they were a wonderful family. That's about what I have to say.
Now, someone who also everyone loves in Owosso. Yeah. And he is my old buddy Bus Spaniola, and he's here with his wife Carol. And I have to tell you, Bus was my 5th grade teacher at St. Paul, and he was the best teacher, grade school teacher I ever had. I can't even remember the other grade school teachers. And my sister Mary Ann, wherever she is, she used to babysit for Bus and Carol. And my first job was working for Bus and Carol at the dairy aisle. And such wonderful people. And Bus, now if we remember the building over there where Tim Hortons was, that used to be Colvin's Furniture. And Bus's family had a dairy store, an ice cream shop in that or something. And Bus has all kinds of stories about that era, about Dewey. And Bus, won't you come up here and share those with us, please? I'm so happy.
It seems rather strange for me to be here talking about a great politician. You know, it's been covered, most of it's been covered, everything has been covered. But I'm here, I think, because Shafe knew that my dad had a store in the building which Dewey was born in. And of course, that was back in the 30s. He was in the building probably, well, before I was born. I was born in 35. And Dad had, I don't know when he opened the place, but he leased the building, obviously. And he was in there until the early 1940s, and then, of course, moved his store down to what used to be called the Flatiron Building.
Yeah, yeah.
And interestingly enough, both places where my dad had a business have been raised or down. But in any event, I first heard of Tom Dewey when a Life magazine came out. Dad was still operating the store over here. And by the way, there's a picture over there of the place, and you'll see it says Anthony's Ice Cream on there.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yes, yeah. Anyway, this magazine, Life magazine, issue of Life magazine came out, and by golly, there was a picture of the building taken from this side of the river, okay? And it showed, of course, the stairway that came down, and also what got my attention was there was a big sign painted on the side advertising my dad's business. So I was informed that Tom Dewey was a very important fellow. And in any event, as time went on, I have a couple of other recollections that maybe it's worth sharing with you here. I vaguely recall the campaign start, as they used to say, started on the Labor Day in 1944. It was a big parade here in Owosso, and Governor Dewey obviously was here to start the program in his hometown. And I recall there were just tons and tons of people on the main street. But what I recall even better than that, of course I was only 9 years old at the time, Shaffer, when that occurred. What I recall better is when I was 13 in 1948, when they had the same kind of a program, a parade on Labor Day, excuse me. And I recall seeing all of these people just crowd into downtown Owosso. In fact, I was standing, if any of you are old enough to remember this, I was in an area where the Center Theater happened to be. Does anyone recall the Center Theater? Anyway, it's in the area where we have our hardware store and so on, Gilbert's. And I was standing there and observing the crowd. And it was a real exciting day, even though I happened to be at the political party at the time. And it was an exciting day, and I recall Governor Dewey going by in the convertible, the crowds cheering, and it just was a great time for the folks. And then behind him came Governor Kim Siegler. Does that name ring a bell? Governor Kim Siegler, who, get this, is 1948, when Siegler's running against Soapy Williams. And his car came by, and of course, people were not clapping. It was kind of a strange situation. And I'm standing there and say, this is the governor of Michigan coming by. And you know, I'm obviously of another political persuasion. And, but anyway, Siegler's car came by and I said, nobody's clapping. So I wasn't taught that way. I was taught to be reasonable. So anyway, I clapped for the governor. And you know what happened? He stopped the car and called me over and said, thank you. Really? I went back home and told my dad what I had done. I thought maybe he'd say I was out of order. And no, he said, that's what we should be doing. There's such a thing as civility. And you know, that taught me a great lesson. The other thing that I would like to say, even though all of it's been covered here, is think about this. Here we are in the city of Owosso, and we have famous people, really famous people, that live within blocks of one another. Think about this. We had the great artist. We had James Oliver Curwood, Thomas Dewey. We go up on Oliver Street, and they're only, those three families were only about 4 to 5 blocks apart. Think about that. How many communities can say that they had a great author, a great artist? It's just to mention a few, obviously, because there are many others here that we can mention. And a candidate for the presidency of the United States twice, governor of the state of New York 3 terms, and a gangbuster who was a great prosecutor. So I don't know what you would call this, but from my perspective, not being an Owosso resident, but being a Corunna resident and proud of Owosso, so I think it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
A pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm just delighted that you invited me to be here, Shaffer.
Oh, gosh.
Let me tell you just one more item, which maybe will draw a laugh. I don't know. Does anyone here recognize the name of Charles Westtown Moore?
Yeah.
He was a mayor of Owosso at one time.
He was what?
He was a mayor of this city at one time. Yes. And this goes back to that 1948 meeting when Governor Dewey was here in town. Charlie Moore apparently was a Democrat because after the parade went through town, right behind it was Charlie's car with the horn blowing with signs on the side, vote for Truman. and maybe I'll share one more thing with you. I should sit down and keep quiet. My dad got some publicity out of the campaign as well because he predicted that Truman was gonna win, and he picked the number of electoral votes very closely, by the way. It made some newspapers in the United States, but Dad got probably some negative things from his local friends who were supporters of the governor. But anyway, it's a pleasure for me to be here, respect what you're doing, and think that, again, Owosso should be very proud of the fact.
Thank you. With Ben's permission, where's Ben?
He just got there.
Okay, why don't we all head over to, in front of Tim Hortons, the historical marker is there. We'll do the unveiling.